The Louisiana State Archives still have the marriage license, but it is yellowed and brittle from age. It has the names of Jeremiah Aldrich and a woman named Celeste. Her last name is just property, and it is written under his big signature. What makes this document so deeply disturbing isn't just the horrible nature of the union. It's about a rich plantation owner marrying his enslaved cook, but also the dark cloud it casts over the events that would follow. In the months after their strange wedding in March 1854, 13 people in the parish would die in strange ways. A silent epidemic of tragedy that seemed to come from the very ground of Willowbrook Plantation. Local newspapers from that time, which had been carefully kept in private collections and smell like dust and decay, hint at a conspiracy so complicated and cruel that local officials may have stopped the investigation to protect some of Louisiana's most powerful families from the scandal. The truth behind this forced marriage, on the other hand, is much worse than just a scandal. It reveals a web of betrayal, cold-blooded revenge, and a kind of psychological torture that was so shocking that even the violent society of the Antebellum South was shocked. The story of Jeremiah Aldrich and the terrible things that happened to him is more than just a story about a fall from grace. It is a detailed story of justice that came from the shadows, a justice that was patient, creative, and completely unforgiving. Let me take you back to a time when honor was worth more than gold, and when a broken trust could kill a man in ways worse than death. It didn't start in 1854, but the complicated chain of events that led to that sinful marriage did. Their roots went back 15 years, to the dark, humid backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, where people made money by selling their bodies and where blood money flowed as freely as the muddy river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich was not a member of the plantation aristocracy that ruled Louisiana society in the 1840s. He was an outsider, the son of a failed tobacco farmer from Kentucky. In 1839, he came to the busy, chaotic port of New Orleans with nothing but a burning ambition and a willingness to do business that more established gentlemen wouldn't touch with their best gloves. He saw chances where others saw only sin and social ruin. He was willing to wade through any moral filth to get the life he thought he deserved. The slave trade was a legal and important part of the Southern economy, but it had a bad reputation among the old Creole families. They liked to keep up the fragile lie that their huge wealth came only from sugar and cotton, not from the systematic buying, selling, and abuse of people. This made a lot of money for men who didn't have to pretend to be someone else, like Jeremiah Aldrich. In the hot, sticky summer of 1840, Aldrich teamed up with Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle, two men whose own desperation matched Aldrich's ruthless ambition. Devo, the youngest son of a sugar baron whose business was going downhill, was desperate for cash to save his family's plantation from creditors who were circling like vultures. Rochelle, a former ship captain who lost everything to yellow fever and bad investments, knew a lot about the illegal slave routes that ran through Cuba and the Caribbean islands. They both saw in each other the parts of a machine that would make money by causing people pain. Their relationship was not one of friendship, but of a shared need to prey on each other. They set up the Delta Trading Company, which they called with a blandness that belied its evil nature. It was based in a rundown warehouse on the filthy outskirts of New Orleans, where the law was weak and people rarely asked where their goods came from. The business made more money than any of them had thought possible. Aldrich's business was different from the legal slave traders in the city center, who dealt in real property with clear titles and fake health certificates. Instead, Aldrich's business focused on what they called recovery services. They trafficked in the lost and forgotten. They bought enslaved people who had escaped from failed plantations, free blacks who had been kidnapped by corrupt and brutal bounty hunters, and, most profitably, fresh captives from illegal ships that still haunted the Atlantic long after the international slave trade was officially banned. The profit margins were very high because their operating costs were very low. They didn't care about the health, housing, or basic humanity of the men, women, and children who came through their doors. They only saw them as numbers in a ledger. For 3 years, the partnership thrived in the shadows of New Orleans society. In the world of finance, they were like ghosts, quickly amassing wealth. They didn't just put their profits back into their shady business. They also put them into legal businesses, carefully buying property and respectability along the way. Devo saved his family's plantation and turned it into one of the most productive sugar operations in St. Charles Parish. His desperation is now a thing of the past. Rochelle, the disgraced captain, bought a fleet of riverboats and turned himself into a respected shipping magnate. The constant flow of money washed away his past. Aldrich, the son of a Kentucky farmer, bought Willowbrook Plantation, a small but profitable cotton farm about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans. It came with a grand colonial mansion with white columns and large porches that made it clear that he was now a member of Louisiana's powerful planter elite. He had bought the life he wanted, but the base of his new world was made up of secrets, violence, and the ghosts of the people he had sold. But success, especially success that comes from such darkness, can make people careless in a dangerous way. Their confidence grew as their money did, and that confidence got the attention of important people. In the spring of 1843, when it was hot and uncomfortable, they heard that federal marshals were starting a quiet but thorough investigation into illegal slave trading along the Gulf Coast. Someone with power had been asking pointed questions about their business, looking at shipping records that should have stayed hidden, and worst of all, talking to some of their former merchandise, people who had escaped or gotten their freedom in other ways. The whispers got louder as they moved through New Orleans docks and banks, threatening to expose and ruin the people who were doing them. The 3 partners had once shared the same goal, but now they were all stuck in a fear that was too strong for them to handle. They could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet as their carefully built world began to fall apart. They met in Aldrich's new study at Willowbrook for an emergency meeting. The room was meant to look like it was from the old world. Aldrich couldn't read the leather-bound books that were all around them or the oil paintings of ancestors who weren't his own. The tension in that room was so thick and heavy that it felt like the air outside in the summer. Each man felt a growing sense of dread as they realized that their empire of human suffering was about to fall apart. Devo, who was always the most nervous of the 3 because of his aristocratic background, suggested they end the partnership right away, burn all the ledgers, and erase all records of their business dealings, as if the Delta Trading Company had never existed. Rochelle, who was a sailor, said that a more measured approach was better. He suggested moving their money to banks in Havana that are outside the country and waiting for the investigation to lose interest and move on. But Jeremiah Aldrich had a different idea, one that showed how morally bankrupt he really was. He didn't see a crisis that everyone needed to deal with. He saw a chance that only he could take. While his partners argued about how to stay alive, Aldrich had already made a cold, hard choice. He wouldn't just end the partnership. He would get rid of it completely. He would kill both men and set up the scene to make it look like they had gotten into a violent fight over money. He would be the only person left alive after a business disagreement that went horribly wrong, with Devo and Rochelle dead. He could get rid of all the proof of their illegal activities and keep all the money they had made for himself. He didn't come up with the plan in a fit of rage. It came to him with the cold, clear clarity of pure evil. He saw the way ahead, a way that would take him to total safety and unimaginable wealth. It would be paved with the bodies of the only 2 men who knew enough to kill him. Devo was worried about going to jail, and Rochelle was worried about money. Aldrich, on the other hand, was calmly planning a double murder and already going over the bloody details of how he would rise to power. It was a hot, moonless night in June 1843 when the murders happened at the same old warehouse where they had been working for 3 years. Aldrich set up the meeting so they could talk about how to get out of the slave trade business for good. The site was chosen with great care. After sunset, the warehouse district was mostly empty, with streets and buildings that were quiet and deserted. The building was already set to be torn down the next month because the city was expanding its commercial port facilities. This meant that any evidence that might still be there would soon be reduced to rubble. Aldrich got there early. The weight of a loaded gun in his coat made him feel better, and the cold steel of a razor-sharp skinning knife hidden in his boot made him feel safe. His plan was cruelly and beautifully simple. He would shoot Devo first because he was weaker and more likely to miss. Then he would fight Rochelle with a knife, and both men would die. He would say he did it in self-defense because he was so scared. The story was already coming together in his head. A sad tale of betrayal and greed in which he would play the part of the innocent victim. He had even gotten his supporting characters ready. Aldrich hired 3 men from the docks in the city before he got to the warehouse. These men could be bought with a few silver dollars. They were told to tell the police that they had seen Devo and Rochelle fighting earlier that day and yelling about money missing from their accounts. Their testimony would give the police a reason to doubt him, which would lead them away from him. When his partners got there, they saw Aldrich already sitting at their usual planning table. There was a bottle of expensive whiskey and 3 glasses set up between stacks of old shipping and ledger documents. He gave off an air of calm control, like a steady hand in a storm that was getting worse. The conversation started out normally. Devo was worried about the legal threats they faced, and Rochelle, who was always practical, laid out a detailed plan to move their assets to banks in Havana, where American law couldn't touch them. As the night went on and the whiskey flowed, Aldrich skillfully guided the conversation toward their wealth, asking them specifically where their cash reserves were hidden and how they kept their individual accounts safe. Rochelle was the first person to notice that something was wrong. The old sailor's instincts, which had been sharpened by years of sailing through dangerous waters and violent port towns, picked up on the small, off-key notes in Aldrich's behavior. It was the way his eyes never quite met theirs, as if he were looking for threats that weren't there in the dim light of the room. It was how his right hand kept moving toward his coat pocket, a small, repetitive gesture that showed he had something to hide. The tension in his voice and the slight tremor when he asked them for more information about their security arrangements and personal account numbers made them nervous. Rochelle's suspicion grew, and a cold knot in his stomach got tighter. He understood that this meeting wasn't about keeping things the same. It was about something else, something much more permanent. Aldrich knew his time was running out when he suggested they put off the meeting and meet again the next day with their lawyers present. The show was over. The time for violence had come. The violence broke out in a shocking, deafening way. Aldrich pulled out his gun and shot Marcus Devo in the chest before the younger man could even think about how the room had changed. The shot sounded like thunder in the huge empty warehouse, and Devo fell backward in his chair, leaving a dark stain of blood on his white linen shirt. His eyes grew wide, not because he was in pain, but because he looked like he had been betrayed in a way that he couldn't understand. But Rochelle, even though she was completely unprepared, was much stronger than Aldrich had thought. The ex-sea captain, who had been in 100 fights on the docks, flipped over the heavy oak table between them, sending ledgers and glasses crashing to the floor. He lunged forward, not with a weapon, but with the jagged neck of the broken whiskey bottle. He slashed at Aldrich's face and opened a deep, painful gash across his left cheek. This wound would leave a permanent livid scar, a reminder of this night for the rest of his life. What happened next was not the clean, staged execution Aldrich had planned. Instead, it was a brutal fight for survival that lasted almost 10 minutes. Rochelle fought with the raw rage of a man who knew what was going on, and wouldn't let himself die quietly in the dark. They crashed through piles of wooden crates, spread years' worth of incriminating papers all over the floor, and left bloodstains on every surface as they fought for control of the skinning knife Aldrich had pulled from his boot. The warehouse was filled with the sounds of their fight, the breaking of wood, the grunts of effort, and the sickening, wet sound of fists hitting flesh. In the end, it wasn't Aldrich's strength that let him down. It was Rochelle's age. He just couldn't keep up with the younger man's energy and determination at 53. Finally, Aldrich was able to defeat him. He drove the long blade deep into Rochelle's stomach and twisted it up toward his heart. The old sailor clawed at his throat in a desperate attempt to get away, but his strength was fading with each ragged breath. But even as Samuel Rochelle died on the dirty floor of the warehouse, he was able to say a few last words, a prophecy of revenge that would follow Aldrich for the rest of his life. "My son," he said in a hoarse whisper that was full of blood. "He knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay." Back then, Aldrich thought these were just the crazy thoughts of a dying man. He had no idea that Felipe, Marcus Devo's quiet, studious younger brother, had been secretly keeping track of their illegal activities for years. He also didn't know that Samuel Rochelle's 17-year-old son, Henri, knew everything about every deal, contact, and crime the Delta Trading Company had ever done. He thought he was getting rid of his only 2 threats, but in his bloody arrogance he had just made 2 more, 2 patient, smart young men who would now have nothing to live for but to kill him. For the next 4 hours, Aldrich carefully and almost artistically set up the crime scene to support the story he had planned. He moved Devo's body so that it looked like the man had been shot while trying to get his own weapon. He then put Rochelle close by, put the bloody skinning knife in his dead hand, and added defensive wounds to his arms to make it look like the 2 victims had been fighting for a long time. He threw money around the room to back up the story of a fight over money, and he broke the office safe to make it look like a robbery that went wrong. To make the lie even more convincing, he even cut his own hands and arms more than once, leaving behind physical proof that he was just an innocent bystander caught up in their violent, deadly fight. He carefully made up every detail to create a reality that would clear him of all charges. He wasn't just a killer, he was also a writer who wrote a story about his own innocence and the blood of his partners. The false witnesses did exactly what they were paid to do. They told the New Orleans police that they had seen Devo and Rochelle fighting over missing partnership funds earlier that night. A dishonest dock worker who also worked for Aldrich said he heard yelling coming from the warehouse around the time of the murders, followed by a gunshot and the sounds of a violent fight. Most importantly, Aldrich had come up with a convincing, emotional reason for being there. He said he had come to help his partners settle their growing argument, but instead he walked into a deadly fight that put his own life in danger. The police, who were busy with more serious crimes in the city's notoriously violent underbelly and eager to close a case involving 3 relatively respectable businessmen, accepted Aldrich's story with only a quick, cursory investigation. The official report said that Devo and Rochelle had killed each other over a business deal, and that the brave Jeremiah Aldrich had barely escaped the same fate. As planned, the warehouse was torn down within a week. Its secrets were turned to dust and rubble, leaving no physical evidence of the partnership's illegal activities or Aldrich's brutal betrayal. Aldrich quickly moved to protect his new wealth after his partners died and were buried, leaving their large assets up for grabs. He went to the city's banks and told them he was the last surviving partner of a real shipping company, showing them a series of carefully forged documents. A skilled but secret forger made these papers, which proved that Devo and Rochelle had agreed to give him all of their business shares if they died. banks that had been wary of three unknown men making large and unusual cash transactions were quick to believe the word of a single, grieving plantation owner who had a documented history of successful cotton production. Over the next few months, Aldrich methodically drained every account, sold every asset, and took possession of every safe deposit box that had belonged to his murdered partners. He thought the whole thing was worth almost $40,000, which was a huge amount of money at the time and would be worth more than $1 million today. He had gotten everything he had ever wanted by just using a bullet and a knife. In his own mind, though, he had gotten rid of the only two people who could definitely link him to the illegal activities of the Delta Trading Company. He could start over, wash the blood off his hands with money and time, and live the rest of his life as a good, honest member of Louisiana society. But Jeremiah Aldrich made a deadly and arrogant mistake by focusing too much on short-term threats and business opportunities. He didn't care at all about the families of the men he killed. He didn't think about the fact that both Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle had younger family members who would soon learn the truth about their deaths, or at least enough of the truth to make them very suspicious. These were young men who wouldn't be happy with the official story. They would spend the next 10 years carefully, methodically, and patiently planning a revenge that would be so elaborate and psychologically devastating that a simple death would seem like a great mercy compared to what they had in store for him. The ghosts in the warehouse were still there. They had just moved to new bodies. When Philippe Devo was 22 years old, his older brother Marcus was killed. Philippe was very different from the other Devo men, who had always put short-term rewards and social status ahead of long-term planning. He had a quiet, calculating intelligence that made him much more dangerous than Aldrich could have ever imagined. Philippe, who was Marcus's closest friend and unofficial business manager, kept his own detailed records of every Delta Trading Company transaction. He kept coded ledgers that showed how they bought slaves illegally. He had copies of shipping manifests for Caribbean routes that were not allowed. And the worst thing was that he had letters from the corrupt officials who had been paid to help them with their secret operations. He knew the business inside and out, but not as a partner. He was a quiet, watchful observer who saw the rot beneath the surface of profit. He had been gathering evidence against the partnership for years, but he never thought it would be used to get back at the people who killed his brother. More importantly, Philippe had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. Philippe thought that the Kentucky newcomer was too eager to get involved in the most brutal and degrading parts of their business from the start. This was even by the low standards of men who traded in human flesh. It wasn't just ambition. It was a hunger that seemed to have no end. He had been quietly looking into Aldrich's past for months before the murders. He found inconsistencies in the history Aldrich gave and financial problems that hinted at much more complicated and hidden reasons than just greed. When Philippe heard about Marcus's death at the family's struggling plantation, he didn't feel sad right away. Instead, he felt a rush of cold, calculating anger. The newspapers told the official story with such certainty that it didn't make sense to anyone who knew the three partners. Marcus was desperate for money, but he was also very careful and would never have attacked Samuel Rochelle in such a violent way. Rochelle, on the other hand, was a methodical businessman who settled disagreements through negotiation instead of with a knife in a dark warehouse, even though he was a rough sailor. But the most telling thing was what Aldrich said about that deadly night. He talked about money and accounts that Philippe knew had already been moved to other places weeks before. It was a small mistake, a small difference, but to Philippe, it was the loose thread that would pull apart Aldrich's whole made-up story. A few days after the funeral, Philippe started his own private investigation into the murders at the warehouse. He discreetly talked to dock workers, looked at shipping records, and even paid off junior police officers to look at the official evidence. He did this with the help of contacts from his brother's business network and men who owed the Devo family favors. What he found out confirmed his worst fears. The crime scene had been carefully set up. The witnesses had obviously been paid to lie because their stories were too similar and too perfect. And the police records had either been purposely left out or had simply disappeared, along with several important pieces of evidence such as letters found on his brother's body. The last piece of evidence that sealed Aldrich's fate was finding out that he had started accessing his murdered partner's money just hours after they died. This showed a level of cold-blooded planning that completely contradicted his emotional story of being an innocent bystander. Henri Rochelle, on the other hand, was doing his own investigation, but it was from a very different and much more advanced point of view. Samuel's son had all of his father's maritime connections at the age of 24, but he also had a formal education in law and business that made him the best person to look into the complicated financial parts of the murders. Henri had worked in banks and shipping companies in New Orleans for a few years, quietly getting to know clerks, managers, and officials who could give him information that Philippe's more direct, evidence-based approach might not have found. He knew that the real story of the crime wasn't in the blood on the floor of the warehouse, but in the ink of the bank drafts and ledgers that came after. Henri's investigation showed how huge Aldrich's theft really was. He carefully looked at bank records, property transfers, and shipping manifests to write down exactly how the killer had methodically stolen all of the Delta Trading Company Partnership's assets. Henri figured out that Aldrich had stolen more than $60,000 in cash, property, and business investments. This was a huge amount of money that came from years of illegal but very profitable operations that were based on the suffering of hundreds of enslaved people. But what really made Henri dangerous was not just that he could find the truth, but that he really understood how Louisiana's legal and financial systems worked. He knew they were corrupt and meant to protect people like Aldrich, instead of bringing them to justice. Henri realized that it would be much more effective to use Aldrich's own greed against him, unlike Philippe, who was first focused on proving Aldrich's guilt with direct evidence that could be brought to court. Henri stopped looking for quick justice in a system that was fundamentally broken and started to make a long-term plan. He would not tell anyone that Aldrich was a killer. Instead, he would methodically and quietly destroy the man's financial foundation, leaving him alone, desperate, and open to the same kind of betrayal and violence that he had so cruelly used on others. He wouldn't go to the law for justice. Instead, he would become the law, and his decision would be total destruction. In the cool fall of 1844, more than a year after their relatives had been killed, Philippe Devaux and Henri Rochelle met for the first time. The meeting took place at a quiet, unassuming restaurant in the French Quarter, where people could talk without worrying about being overheard. Philippe set up the meeting so that he could show Henri his proof and try to get them to work together on their separate investigations to make them stronger. Neither man expected how well their different skills and resources would work together, or how their shared, burning desire for justice would take over the next 10 years of their lives. A conspiracy started in that dark room with a bottle of cheap wine. By the time they said goodbye, hours later, their separate plans for revenge had come together into something much more complicated and dangerous. A carefully planned scheme to kill Jeremiah Aldrich using the same methods he had used to kill their fathers. Not the barking of dogs, but the quiet scratching of pens and ledgers started the hunt. By the spring of 1845, their plan was starting to come together. The first step was to slowly and carefully get into Aldrich's social and business networks. It would be a campaign of inches, not miles. Philippe started going to the same gentlemen's clubs, political gatherings, and social events that Aldrich was working hard to establish himself as a respectable planter. He did this by using his family's connections in Louisiana society. He didn't want to confront the man who killed his brother directly. Instead, he wanted to learn about him, his habits, his weaknesses, his friends, and most importantly, his money problems. Philippe was lucky to have his late brother's easy charm and social grace. Within a few months, he had skillfully made himself one of Aldrich's casual friends, someone he could trust enough to share drinks and small talk with, but not someone he would ever see as a threat. He turned into a ghost in Aldrich's life, always there, always watching. And his friendly smile hid a cold and patient hatred. Henry, on the other hand, was using his connections in the banking world to carefully track every dollar that came in and out of Aldrich's business empire. He learned that the plantation owner's apparent wealth wasn't a solid fortress. It was a house of cards built on a shaky base of risky investments, leveraged loans, and speculative business ventures that made a lot of money in the short term, but left him with huge debts in the long term. Henry learned that Aldrich had a serious and compulsive gambling problem, which was the most important thing he learned. He was losing thousands of dollars every week at high-stakes poker games and horse races. He paid for these losses by borrowing more and more against the future cotton crops on his plantation, which made him more and more desperate. This addiction, this one big flaw, gave Philippe and Henry the perfect chance they had been looking for. They could use it to hurt him, like a hole in his armor through which they could pour their poison. Aldrich thought that his gambling was a private sin. He had no idea they were going to be the cause of his downfall. By 1848, Henri had gotten a high-ranking job at the First National Bank of New Orleans, which was the bank that held the main mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From this strong position, he was able to skillfully and subtly change Aldrich's credit arrangements. He made sure that the interest rates on loan renewals were a little bit higher, but not so much that you could notice. He changed the payment schedules, which caused big problems with cash flow during important planting and harvesting times. He slowly and carefully pushed the plantation owner into a state of deep financial desperation that made him open to any suggestion or offer of help. At the same time, Philippe had been getting to know some of New Orleans' most famous gambling operators, men who ran the high-stakes games where fortunes could be won or lost in a single night. Philippe used a series of carefully placed bribes and promises of future favors to get Aldrich invited to games that cost more and more money. The stakes were higher, and the other players were secretly working together, following Philippe's signals, to make sure that the plantation owner would lose much more than he could ever afford to pay back. The patience and subtlety of their approach made it so beautiful that it was devastating. Instead of confronting Aldrich directly or taking violent revenge that would not be satisfying, they were slowly destroying the financial foundation that held up his whole social position and the carefully built image he had of himself. Every time a loan came due, it added to the stress. He got more and more desperate every time he lost a bet. And every time he tried to make quick money by making another risky investment that didn't work, he got closer to losing everything and never being able to get it back. Their 10 years of hard work were starting to pay off by 1851. Aldrich owed nearly $30,000, and the interest payments alone were eating up most of the money his plantation made each year. He had to sell some of his land to pay off his gambling debts, and ugly rumors were starting to spread among Louisiana's wealthy planters that Willowbrook Plantation was in big financial trouble. The man who had seemed so strong was starting to look like just another failure, another man who had been broken by the harsh economy of the South. But Philippe and Henri didn't want to just lose money. Their main goal was much more personal. They wanted to put Aldrich through the same kinds of humiliation, degradation, and fear that their dead fathers had gone through in their last moments. They wanted him to know for sure that his wealth had come from blood, that his respectability was a lie, and that justice had finally found him after 10 years. They would have to do more than just make Aldrich desperate for money in the last part of their revenge. They had to put him in a situation where he had no choice but to accept whatever terms they offered, even if those terms were humiliating or dangerous. Henri came up with the last brilliant idea, using Aldrich's own slaves to kill him. Every plantation owner was always afraid that their slaves would rise up against them, and that fear could be used. But instead of calling for a violent uprising, Henri suggested a more subtle and psychologically damaging way to do things. They would use Aldrich's forced marriage to one of his own slaves as the worst public humiliation, one that would ruin his reputation and leave him with no legal way to escape the consequences. It wasn't by chance that Celeste was chosen to be the last person to humiliate Aldrich. Philippe and Henri had spent months looking into every person who lived and worked at Willowbrook Plantation. They were looking for someone whose forced marriage to their target would cause the most social damage and give them a way to control Aldrich's fate. Celeste met all of their needs perfectly. She was a big, scary woman at the age of 38. But what made her so valuable was her intelligence, her unwavering loyalty to her own survival, and most importantly, her icy hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Celeste had never tried to hide her anger at the man who owned her, unlike many enslaved people who had learned to hide their true feelings behind a mask of compliance. She did a good job as head cook, but anyone who looked closely could see the cold rage behind her eyes whenever Aldrich was around. Her hate came from deep inside her. Aldrich bought her in 1847 and took her away from her husband and 3 kids. He had let them be sold to different owners in different states. He thought it was a waste of time to feed unnecessary mouths. This one act of casual cruelty had planted a seed of revenge in Celeste that had been growing for 7 long years. The way to get to Celeste was very sensitive. Philippe and Henri used intermediaries, free people of color who worked in New Orleans markets, to talk to each other. At first, they offered small amounts of money for information about Aldrich's habits. What they found was more than they could have ever imagined. Celeste not only knew her owner's weaknesses, but she had also been waging a quiet psychological war against him for years by oversalting his food to make his stomach problems worse, breaking his favorite things by accident, and spreading rumors among the other enslaved people about his money problems. When Philippe and Henri finally told Celeste who they really were and what they were going to do to Aldrich, she reacted right away and without a doubt. She would do anything to help them kill the man who had killed their family and ruined her own life. Her only requirement was that she be free and safe on her way to Canada. They agreed right away. The last details were worked out. Aldrich would be completely broke, making him an easy target for an offer he couldn't refuse: marry Celeste in a legal ceremony or die right away at the hands of his creditors. The last trap was about to go off. Jeremiah Aldrich's last stop was a converted warehouse near the New Orleans waterfront, where the city's most desperate men would risk everything on the turn of a card. The February night in 1854 was hot and sticky, and a thick fog rolled in from the Mississippi. Aldrich came with a bag containing $8,000, which was his last-ditch effort to keep his plantation from going into foreclosure. He had no idea that Philippe and Henri had planned the whole night, making sure that everyone else at the high-stakes table was working together to take all of his money. 5-card stud was the game. Aldrich won a few small things early on, which gave him a false sense of security, but as the stakes got higher, he started to make risky bets out of desperation. By 2 a.m., he pushed his last $3,000 into the center of the table, confident his pair of kings would save him. He lost to a full house held by a cold-eyed stranger. As the reality of his complete ruin sank in, the other players departed, leaving him alone with the winner. The stranger finally spoke, his voice carrying a slight French accent. "Mr. Aldrich," he said, "I think we need to talk about your outstanding obligations. Like luck, patience runs out eventually." It was at that moment that Philippe Deveau stepped out of the shadows. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," Philippe said, his face lit up by the flickering gaslight. He looked just like his brother who had been killed. Maybe because you have. Aldrich's heart sank. This wasn't a game. It was an execution. Henri Rochelle came out of another corner, closing the circle. Henri said, "My father always said you were smart, Mr. Aldrich," and his voice dripped with scorn. Smart enough to kill 2 men and take their life's work, but not smart enough to know that dead men sometimes leave behind sons. They put the proof on the poker table: bank statements, property transfers, and sworn statements. It was too much. They told him how they had spent years getting all of his debts. He didn't have anything. They had complete control over him. Aldrich whispered, "What do you want?" Felipe smiled, but it was a scary, predatory smile. He said, "There is one way to avoid a painful death. One way you might be able to keep breathing. You will have to give up some of your dignity to do this." Henri leaned in, and his eyes sparkled. "Jeremiah, you're going to marry one of your slaves, publicly and legally. You're going to make Celeste your lawful wife." The idea was so horrible and so far outside of what was acceptable in antebellum society that Aldrich couldn't understand it at first. It was the end of society. He stammered, "You're crazy. No preacher would, no court would." But they had already taken care of everything. A minister who owed them money would do the legal ceremony. He had a simple choice: refuse and die a horrible death in the warehouse, or agree to be humiliated in public in exchange for a short extension of his life. He signed the marriage contract after a long, painful silence. The ceremony was set for the next evening at Willowbrook. On the morning of March 15th, 1854, the sky was gray and heavy. People who were invited by Philippe and Henri in Aldrich's name came and were confused. They had been told that they would see a great act of Christian kindness. Aldrich, dressed in his best suit, played his part with the desperate conviction of a man on a scaffold. Celeste wore a simple but beautiful dress and walked with a quiet dignity that made the guests feel uneasy. When the minister said they were husband and wife and told Aldrich to kiss his bride, his face went pale. But Celeste steadied him by rising to meet his lips in a short, chaste kiss that sealed their legal union and began the final, painful phase of his destruction. The first month of their marriage went by in a scary, normal way that wasn't real. Celeste was a model wife to the outside world, running the house with strict authority. But inside the walls of Willowbrook, a slow and quiet fear was growing. Aldrich started to see small differences. The coffee he drank in the morning had a slightly bitter taste. His dinners made him feel sick and very tired. He started having headaches that made it hard for him to think, and dizzy spells. At first, he blamed the stress of his situation, but as his health got worse and worse, a colder, more frightening thought took hold. Dr. Warren, the local doctor, came to see him and confirmed his fears. The doctor's diagnosis was clear: chronic poisoning, probably with arsenic, given in small cumulative doses over the course of several months. He said that the condition was always deadly. Aldrich knew that Celeste was killing him on purpose, and that every meal she made could be the end of him. He tried to keep himself safe by making his own food in secret and locking himself in a guest room at night. But his paranoid actions only made him feel more alone. His neighbors thought his reasonable fear was crazy. Celeste did a great job of playing the worried, devoted wife. Her fake worry made his desperate attempts to save himself look like the crazy talk of a man who had lost his mind. Celeste planned a dinner party for their 3-month anniversary, and that was the end. Aldrich, who was scared and weak, planned to eat nothing. But Celeste opened and poured a special bottle of wine in front of all the guests. Aldrich drank the toast because he was stuck. When he raised the glass, he saw a flash of cold, happy satisfaction in his wife's eyes. The poison worked right away. Celeste threw herself across his body as he fell to the ground, gasping for air. Her fake grief stopped the doctor from helping. She leaned in close to his ear and whispered in a triumphant voice that was lost in the noise, "Jeremiah, Marcus Devo was my cousin. Samuel Rochelle was my uncle. I've been working with their son since 1845. I've been waiting for this." He passed away on the floor of his dining room. The cause of his death was found to be natural. Celeste inherited Willowbrook as his legal heir and quickly signed it over to Philippe and Henri, who paid her well and made arrangements for her to go to Canada. They turned the plantation into a stop on the Underground Railroad, using the money from a slave trader to free other people and completely erase Aldrich's legacy.